Welcome, travelers and wild-hearted ones. Today, I'm joined by the remarkable James W. Perkinson, a theologian of the straits, a poet of the waters, and a weaver of political spirituality for these unraveling times. From the embattled currents of Detroit to the ancient wells of biblical and indigenous memory, Jim invites us to wade deeper into the living mystery of water, land, spirit, and struggle. Together today, we'll explore how apocalypse can be an opening, how Trickster might just be our greatest guide, and how ancient wisdom can ignite a fiercely grounded hope in the face of empire's decay. This is a conversation for the ones who still remember, and for those just beginning to listen. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction. We probably just ended here. I'm not sure if this is a little bit downhill from here.
We're going to be, talking about, in a way, the body of your work, but also particularly for this book, political spirituality in an age of eco-apocalypse. And I just wanted to ask, Jim, for those encountering your work for the first time, what has drawn you to walk the razor's edge between activist street theology, indigenous wisdom, and this kind of poetic insurgency?
Yeah, it's a big story. Try to be succinct with it. And it's evolving and ongoing. I grew up in Cincinnati, came to Detroit fresh out of college as an evangelical charismatic, joining a Christian community on the Near East side of Detroit, part of the poorest congressional district in the country at the time. A bunch of people, black and white, married and single, who were pooling income and assets on a poverty level basis, making major life decisions together, and out of that evolving ministry program, running a school, daycare center, clothing exchange shop, food pantry, and ultimately getting into the legacy of white supremacy in that neighborhood by tackling housing questions, working with dwellers in apartment buildings to become the owner managers of their buildings in a cooperative legal structure. And for me, initially, I thought I was on mission to help poor folk in the inner city deal with their reality. And it took 8 years to get past that white flatulence and have my eyes finally begin to see the amazing survival skills, capacity to take minimal resources and yield maximum meaning on the part of low-income African Americans. Kids taking boom boxes, convening parties on broken down porches, make you forget any club you'd ever been to, grandmothers on porches on summer eves, spinning stories, make you forget any sitcom you'd heard, 28 people in one side of a duplex, having to cook 24/7, sleep in shifts through the 3 bedrooms, but just and a lot of dysfunction and that many people in that tight of space, but amazing capacity to generate vitality and humor and commentary and laughter. And once I got so I could see it, I realized I'm not here to help anybody do anything, but to learn from a very different point of view than I grew up with. And particularly to learn to what I gradually grew to recognize was an ongoing embodiment and innovation of what went back to West and Central Africa in a more indigenous vein, run through the slave enterprise coming out in the racism post-Civil War to survive an impossible circumstance, particularly innovating with sound, with percussion, with this energizing innovation that was communal. It was call response. Any given interaction was not just about exchanging information, but enhancing bodily energy and vitality. And once I got so I could see that as a white guy, then fell in love with it and had to negotiate that because it's not mine to take. And yet, if I'm going to be in this environment, that's the language I need to learn. So let it up inside my body, rearranging molecules, this amazing vocabulary of antiphonal sound exchange. And that came out for me as poetry, as spoken word poetry later on. But I would understand it as a spiritual vocabulary that isn't beholden simply to words on a page and doctrines from a council, but is a bodily innovation that is at one level uncontainable in its ongoing capacity to innovate and renovate and vitalize. So that was the first thing that got me going. And then met a Filipina late in life, never married until I was 50, and quickly knew with her this was the person I'd been looking for. But that introduced me to a whole nother cultural venture, having to learn a very different repertoire of communication. A white guy runs through the black inner city face to face with the first and only official colony of the U.S., the Philippines, starting in 1898, where we killed 500,000 to 1 million Filipinos in the process of pacifying the country, to the population. And all that history now throbbing in between my body and hers, and this most intimate relationship of my life, had to get up to speed, and still getting up to speed 24 years later, on a culture of indirection, of very nuanced, subtle communications, what is called high context, where I'm supposed to be able to read all the bodily cues without explicit language. And so that was another thing. And then the third thing was with her, as we struggled with all these questions of settler colonialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, oppression of all kinds, asking deeper and deeper questions, and finally getting to whose land are we on? We're actually on stolen land all over in this country and many other places in the world, where Euro colonizers pilfered the soil through treaty and war and subterfuge, and yet, and the biggest genocide on the planet, and yet Native folk are still around. There are roughly 40,000 Native folk in Metro Detroit. And so starting to try to learn from them, not continue the disappearance of Native people, or for Lily, my wife, back in the Philippines, the Aita people who were indigenous there, and her Malay ancestors colonized them before being colonized by the Spanish and then by the U.S. But not continuing this policy of disappearance, but pulling up on the surface, learning about, engaging with Native communities, and learning about the doctrine of Christian discovery, how the land was stolen and remains now. That doctrine, it remains encoded U.S. law, Johnson v. McIntosh, that erased the only reason people who look like me can claim title to property in this continent, which is the Christian background that we carry. It's a kind of magic wand that papal bulls and then Protestant leaders waved back in Europe that said God owns the land, all the land on the earth. Therefore, God's representatives on earth own all the land on the earth. So your colonizers owned the land before they got here.
Wow.
Everybody else who's not Christian is on the land simply by pleasure of the sovereign owners of the land. And that got written into our law and still informs our society from top to bottom.
Yeah.
So anyway, learning about all of that has been my story. It's ongoing on every one of those three major frontiers. And that last one, learning from indigenous folk, Anishinaabe folk here, Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Huron, Wendat, Delaware, Fox, Sauk, etc., and the Aita back in the Philippines, then also going back in my own ancestry to back behind the white Faustian bargain to when people, Celtic and Nordic and Teutonic, lived on the land in a symbiotic, not destructive way, in an indigenous way back in my ancestry. Learning to recover some of that. There aren't living communities I can look to back there, except for the Sami up above the Arctic Circle. But there are there's musics, there's foods, there's mythologies, there's rituals, there's memory of all kinds that is worthy of recovery and honoring as I live my life now in this mess we're in. And when Lily and I listen to indigenous folk, they are very often pointing away from themselves to the more than human world as their elders, their teachers, their progenitors. They'll tell their myths of origin, tracing their line back to a whale if they're Inuit, or to corn if they're Mayan, and so on. And that deep respect for the creatures that have been here longer than we have been as a species, codified in their mythology and ritual in local ecologies of biodiversity that gives rise to their culture, their language, their habits, their spirituality. So it's all of that. So it's really 4 different kinds of encounter.
Yeah. Those are some very rich kinds of encounter. And before following, hopefully, several of those threads in our conversation, I want to actually go to ground zero, Jim, because I want to know how you got as proficient as you are at listening, because you had several strikes against you. You're white, you're a man, you were an evangelical charismatic. All 3 of those categories of people tend to like having answers more than asking questions. So how in the world, being socialized into all of those identities, did you even get to the point where you wanted to listen to your neighbors in Detroit, where you wanted to listen to your Filipino wife, where you wanted to listen to indigenous streams, and you wanted to listen to the more than human world? Like, how did you even get there?
Yeah. Well, again, big story. I'll only tell a couple things in relationship to it. The neighborhood I grew up in Cincinnati, my family was the only Protestant family in an all-Catholic neighborhood, tons of kids, all the other kids going to parochial school together. For whatever reason, I fell in love with sports at about the age of 8 and became a jock, went from chasing the young women on the playground at noontime to hanging with the guys, playing softball, football, basketball, etc. And then when I got home from grade school, if I wanted to continue that, the only place to do that was on neighbors' turf with neighbors' kids. And initially, when I would go to play basketball on a gravel court in a gully behind the next door neighbor's house, if they let me play ball, they'd only let me throw the ball in from out of bounds. If the ball got muddy, they'd grab me and wipe the ball off on my pants. If their feet got muddy, they'd me wipe their feet off on my pants. We played football in another area in the neighborhood. I played center maybe once per game. They'd let me go out for a pass. If I caught it, both sides would jump on me and rough me up. What we would call bullying today. I didn't have the words for it then. And my only way of dealing with it was to elevate my skills, but never got so I broke into the group socially. And that ostracism was nothing like what people of color experience or women in many circumstances experience, but nonetheless real enough that it left scar tissue and an ongoing experience of what it's like to be on the outside. So I think that has to do with where I am today and who I am today. And then again, immersion, went to a high school that was a third WASP, a third Jewish, third African American. So I was in the mix of different cultures and it actually was a combined junior high and high. So for those 6 years, I was dealing day in and day out with cultural difference, racial difference. And then a student prayer group during my University of Cincinnati days, charismatic group I helped lead. There are about 10 of us that became like a little community over the 5 years of our undergraduate degrees, 2 of whom were African-American women from the inner city of Detroit. And that's where my real exposure to Black culture began to up the ante. Those 2 young women threw down the gauntlet to the rest of us, and we were clueless. All we knew to do was to hang on to each other and managed to do that in spite of our ignorance of what we were channeling as people. And so that was the precursor to Detroit. And then Detroit, as I said, it's really that slow motion arrangement of my body under a very different, can we put a pause here for a second? I'll talk about this later. I'm getting summoned by a red bird. I need to go feed. It'll take 2 minutes.
No worries.
I'm back.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Okay.
As I said, I'll talk about that later, what that's all about.
No worries.
Yeah. So is that slow motion recognition that listening has way more to do with than just what goes in your ears. It's a whole bodily thing. And in Black culture, it's a rhythmic structure of embodiment, talked about as call response, where you need to become sensitized to the rhythmic exchange of energy through gesture, through pace, through facial grimacing and laughter. And you can innovate in the midst of that rhythmic structure, but you need to do it in a way that recognizes the rhythm if it's going to be a communication on Black terms rather than on white terms. And so slowly learning about that, learning that listening is a deep enterprise that we never get to the bottom of. And over the years, as I worked through Black culture, Filipino culture, indigenous culture, and then more than human world, slowly coming to recognize that it's communication all the way up and down. Trees are communicating in amazingly intense ways. Animals are, mycelium are, even bacteria are putting out chemical signatures all the time and sensing what's called a quorum. How many of them are present in any given location, and they change their behavior once that feedback comes to them from the environment about their population numbers in a given scenario. So listening, particularly for us modern folk who are so detached from the natural world, the wild world, the more than human world, we have been successfully, according to the Spanish colonial enterprise, reduced down to become much smaller selves than we used to be when we lived simpatico with the land.
Yeah, it's to our own detriment that we shoehorned ourselves into this diminished reality. What I'm hearing is that the ways that you came to listen was first by recognizing and honoring your own pain. Like, it's not the Depression Olympics. It's not that yours was somehow greater than others, but it was real and you experienced it. And then also those relational skills, that openness that you had to those that were in your immediate surrounding who began to challenge your reality structures and invite you into a broader way of being, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's ongoing, and it's also learning to receive the communication of anger from people who are not like you without running away or flaring in response.
Yeah.
And that particularly was something I learned, I think, on the racial frontier in interaction with Black folk. And I would now say that Black humor and Black anger are my deepest teachers, my deepest pedagogy. But yes, at times being legitimately hit with Black anger directed at me for one kind of behavior or another when white supremacy would channel itself through me. And I'm, to my dying day, going to be vulnerable to that given our society and my upbringing. And I rely on that challenge coming at me to help me see what I'm doing at any given point in time. And yes, I become much more aware of the layers and depths at which that history and that culture of white supremacy, Eurocolonialism, cis male assumption and arrogance, all of that. It's much bigger than me. It's a cultural and societal phenomenon that easily shows up in this body. And part of my ongoing work is to take in the rebuff when it comes and learn from that.
Yeah. Well, how do you do that? Because I know that when anger comes at me, especially if it comes at me in a cross-cultural context, whether it's a woman or whether it's a person of color or non-binary person, like it's those classic Fs. I'm inclined to either fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. Like there's just sort of our natural mammalian instincts of how to face something that feels like a threat. And oftentimes anger does feel like this sort of existential threat. So on your good days, what do you do differently than one of those 4F responses?
Yeah, for me, it's a matter of believing and living into being a complex creature, that I'm capable of holding more than one depth of feeling at the same time in my body, that I can register the anger and feel all four, those Fs, rise up in me, feel angry in response, like I really don't like being the recipient of someone else's anger, and accept that that is partially legitimate. Ask another question about, okay, and what do I need to learn from this? My personal life, where I've lived for most of my adult life, has been in a Black or Filipino context. And I've studied all this stuff. I know the history deeply. And I know that we are in no wise removed from the ongoing violence and trauma and outworking of that history. We've never dealt with it. It's happening to people all around us all the time. Palestine's just one little major version of it right now. But underneath our feet are native folk who've been genocidally disappeared to the tune of 60 to 145 million folk over the last 5 years. 30 to 50 million Africans genocidally killed off in the process of enslaving 12 million, bringing them over. So I know all of that, and I know I need to take this little tiny rebuff of anger as a pedagogical invitation to feel a tiny bit of the pain that's still throbbing between these different indices of difference, race, class, gender, and so on.
You just named some big numbers there, quantities of people who have been wiped off the map that it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. I do think that the double-edged sword of the prevalence of social media in this day and age is it can rehumanize what even a single death looks like, because unlike network news of generations ago that would sanitize death, sometimes without even wanting to, we might literally see a person dying on a reel that shows up on our social media, which when we become desensitized to that becomes a whole other level of horror. But given that, when I hear those numbers, those quantities of folks, whether, indigenous to our continent, North America, or killed in the midst of the enslavement of African people, I feel like it's another one of those, almost like a 4F response, but it's either that I want to rationalize it and justify it, like, well, that's just, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. That's just the way the world works. And we've got to suck it up, buttercup. Or collapse entirely in the face of that and say, well, shit, like what what can I even do? Like I bear the face and the skin tone, and in some cases the ancestry of the folks who have done this. Like it's all terrible. Why even bother? So is there a way to not be in those extremes of justification and collapse?
Yeah. A couple things in relationship to that. One is the social media piece. We see deaths on social media on a screen. And yeah, that's more available to us as it's going on around the world than ever before, on the one hand. On the other hand, seeing it on the screen is not the same as actually being face to face with it. When
Works.
we're together right now, our pupils are not dilating together the way they would be if we're face to face. Our breath is not syncing up. Oxytocin is not firing, and mirror neurons are not going off. I'm not really experiencing you in an embodied form, or you me. And that's the same with the death we see on a screen, which I think works to the detriment of our being able to take it in and be horrified by it. Normalizes it as, oh yeah, this is just like the entertainment that I watched last night. My body can't distinguish between those. So that's one thing. I'm deeply concerned with what is going on with social media and now AI and what it's doing to our capacity to listen. That's one thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, yeah, what to do with all of that? I think to take it in and be taught by it at multiple levels. And for me, for Lily in particular, my wife, as we have lived, we have, for whatever reason, we're sort of go for the jugular piece, the way we function. We want to get to the depths of whatever it is we see going on. And so for me, having big numbers like that, big indices of violence, I want to know, where did it come from? Is it just some bad gene up inside Euro heritage people? No, I don't think it's that. What accounts for it? And as we pursued that question over decades, more and more, I would say the wrong turn was when we went from living in scale in our local ecologies with all the other life forms assembled by biodiversity and water flows in that local ecozone. When we went from living that way, primarily as hunter-gatherer folk, but also to a degree, small-scale sustainable agriculture, small-scale pastoralism or pastoral nomadism in grasslands, when we moved away from those three ways of living into these larger assemblages called city-states that pulled us away, some of us away from hands-on relationship with the more than human world, in particular the elites presiding over, the ruling classes presiding over city-state systems, working now to extract surplus rather than just enough to live on day to day. That's where we've gotten into this ongoing scale of violence that in its modern industrial, now digital form, it is so overwhelming. And yes, it is overwhelming. I don't think we are a species that was built to live globally or even built to live in great big urban societies. Our DNA was shaped by 3 million years, if you consider Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Australopithecine to be part of our line, or 200 to 300,000 years if you're going to limit it to Homo sapiens only. Overwhelmingly, more than 95% of our time on the planet, we lived in small-scale hunter-gatherer societies, 150 people or less. That set our DNA on its frequency. We're good at that. We're good at handling what's going on about 100 yards around us emotionally. We can respond to that accurately. When we get into more representative systems of having to discern meaning and feeling, that's where it's not clear we are a species designed to live the way so many of us are now living. 5,000 years in these city-state systems, roughly 6,000 years, is the blink of an eye from an evolutionary perspective. And some anthropologists today will talk about the rule of 150, that they'll do analyses of Facebook accounts and say, you may have hundreds of names on your Facebook account. You will deal with, on average, with any degree of coherence and consistency, about 143. So far, we're a species that can do that well. Beyond that, look, we're drabs. And the trick is abysmal.
Yeah. So
More than 100 civilizations that have come and gone, almost all of them a 200 to 300 year boom bust cycle. When they're in the boom cycle, it seems like, yeah, this is the primary way to be human. Everything that happened before this was primitive, backward. We want to leave it behind. This is the way to do it. And then it crashes because it devastates the ecology, the so-called resource base, fractures into civil war, has to go elsewhere to get material to live on, inevitably then in war, etc.
So our disharmony and organized violence is in many ways the problem of scale. It's us becoming too big for our britches, so to speak, and becoming more rapacious and consumptive and extractive in our economies, which absolutely forms us as persons and erodes our empathy.
Absolutely. Marcia Bjornerud, who's a geologist, talks about the paleontology database project that did a project examining ecosystems across the planet over the last 500 million years. And what they have come up with is that there is a scale relationship, trophic scaling laws. Troph is a Greek word meaning eating, that correlates body size inversely with population numbers. That is to say, everything is eating everything else. That's the way life is built. The bigger bodied you are, the more you have to consume smaller bodied creatures to compose your body, the smaller your population numbers are. And the coefficient from bacteria at the base to the largest mammoth at the top has held constant in all kinds of diverse ecosystems for 475 million years. Species come and go in the niches, but the relationship of population numbers to body size has remained constant and balanced until humans invented agriculture, she would say. We seem to be hell-bent on trying to prove ourselves an exception to that coefficient. Are we going to do that? Well, then let's do good at the moment.
Yeah, agriculture is the ultimate boom and bust cycle, surplus and famine cycle, and leads to so much social stratification. And a lot of people don't realize it. And like you said, when a society, when a civilization is on an upswing, it thinks we're the pinnacle of evolution. And I would say that even some limitedly useful models of cultural evolution these days do assume a kind of progress, do assume a kind of benignity to our current, moral standing as relative to our ancestors. And it reminds me of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. The assumption that what we're doing now is inherently more enlightened and more benighted than ever before. But I think one silver lining to the absolute, shit show that our current political theater is emerging in the United States right now is that I think a lot of people are realizing that while we might have greater technology now, we're absolutely still capable of the worst barbarisms that we misattribute to quote unquote savages, this slander of indigenous folks that no, that's a projection of us. And we're if anything, even more efficient at killing now. We're more efficient imposing our will upon those that we deem inferior or inconvenient, and not to mention the more than human world. And it's devastating.
Yeah. And, there are people like Steven Pinker who will say, no, it's been a constant reduction in violence over the course of the big scale of history. But of course, I shouldn't say of course, he's been challenged for cherry picking some of the numbers, particularly in relationship to hunter-gatherer cultures. And he's only calculating human beings. He's not calculating the more than human world, the 100 to 200 species we're sending into extinction every day with our society right now, many of whom, or some of whom, we're utterly dependent. And we send one too many into extinction, we're going to collapse as well. Which is to say that I don't think you can assess human well-being simply in terms of human bodies. I'm a minority in my own body. I've got something like 38 trillion bacteria staring at you through the screen right now, and 380 trillion viruses. And if they're not there, I'm not here. I'm a minority in my own body. I'm a little living, walking ecosystem. I'm not just a single human being. I'm not primarily a single human being. I'm more than 60% water. And all this stuff comes and goes. I don't live within the perimeters of my body. I have to have stuff coming up my nostrils all the time, going in my mouth all the time, coming out my rear end all the time, or this body won't exist. The parameters of, for me anymore, the scale at which human beings live is a local ecosystem, not a globe, not a nation state or a city state. It's the ensemble of biodiversity organized by water called a watershed for most of our history on the planet. But now I am living globally. My food's coming on average 1,367 miles. And has to, because so many of us are living in city centers that are not able to grow their own food and not surrounded by hinterlands where they can grow the food to supply their population. Well, on average, George Monbiot, quoting this number from England a couple of years ago, food has to travel 1,367 miles for everybody on the planet to be fed. That's insane.
Yeah.
That it takes to do that when you could grow it right outside your door.
Yeah.
If you need to walk.
It's, for anyone who's paying attention, these realities ought to be wildly disconcerting and existentially challenging. And I think that whether someone is coming from a traditional our culture religious background, such as Christian or Jewish or Muslim, or whether someone is like, yeah, I've checked out of all that, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I've taken on Buddhism, like these are all really jarring questions. And I want to mildly bring it back to some of the questions we had talked about beforehand. I love how we are diving into these deep waters here. But one of the things that you mentioned was how, we have a minority vote in our own bodies and beings because we have this rich ecosystem and we're like 60% water. So let's bring it back to water by way of possibly discerning how our spiritualities, whatever they are, might serve as useful compass points rather than being part of the problem like they often are. Another title for this political spirituality in an age of eco-apocalypse is political spirituality for a century of water wars, which I think has a way cooler cover, even though it's exponentially more expensive because it's an academic hardcover. But
now in soft cover now. So
now it's the soft cover. Yeah. So my question is about water, because in this book, you describe water not only as a resource, which is, of course, how our managerial modern minds have limited it, but as an ancestor, as a portal, and even as a rebel. So how did you come to experience water as this living and speaking presence?
Yeah. So for me, it began with the Detroit water wars, so-called water shutoffs, when an emergency manager was imposed by a Republican legislature starting in 2013 against the wishes of more than half the state of Michigan in a vote taken in 2012. And the legislature convened a lame duck session, passed a new version of the bill that just got voted down, which would allow the governor to impose an emergency manager for any municipality where he deemed there was a financial crisis. That lame duck session attached an appropriations bill to this bill they were voting on, which meant it was not subject to ballot initiative. And by 2013, Detroit and then many other majority Black or majority minority cities in Michigan were under emergency managers imposed by the governor within a year to 2 years. Virtual dictatorship. That person could terminate contracts, including union contracts, put up for sale city assets to whomever at whatever price they deemed, did not have to answer to anybody else. And that galvanized pushback. And in particular, the emergency manager in Detroit by 2014 had given Wrecking Corporation a $5.6 million contract, which eventually got up to more than $12 million. It began sweeping through 4 neighborhoods to shut off anybody who was $150 or 2 months in arrears.
Oh my God.
Turning off the water early in the morning before people got out of bed. So you'd get up out of bed and you don't have water anymore. And then the state of Michigan is mandated to pull your kids out. It's illegal to raise kids in a house that doesn't have running water on. So decimating entire communities. And older African-American women, younger hip-hop heads, an assortment of the rest of us got involved, pushing back, demonstrations in the street, going to board meetings to raise issue, writing newspaper articles, and doing nonviolent civil disobedience, blocking shut-up drives over the course of the years that followed. And that heightened my awareness of water, who has access, who doesn't, how is it being used. And by 2015, Flint had begun to go through its crisis under an emergency manager as well, where the switch from the Flint River or the Detroit system to the Flint River had precipitated lead and iron and other toxins from the piping. And it was a major and even to this day, ongoing health crisis. So we decided to combine the two struggles and did a Detroit to Flint water walk over the course of 7 days, stopping off in churches along the way, but marching, doing press conferences, artistic poetry and music events at night. But it began with a ritual at the Hart Plaza, Detroit River, at the base of downtown Detroit, with Mona Stonefish, an Ojibwe woman, pulling water out of the Detroit River and doing ritual according to her tradition over the water. And she not only spoke about the water, she spoke to the water. And I watched that. I already knew indigenous cultures related to water as personal, as agent, as spiritual, as living creature, but this was the first time I'd seen it. And up until then, the watchword of this movement had been water is a human right.
Uh-huh.
That's true, but even more deeply and more crucially, first of all, water is a water woman. She belongs to herself, often gendered as she, sometimes as he or they, however you want to use pronouns. And that launched me into the exploration that became this book, which was really about taking off from that moment and the whole struggle politically to ask, what is water in the traditions that have shaped me? Let me listen to traditions here where I live, Anishinaabe traditions about water like the one I've just seen. Let me learn about that as much as I can, not to take it, not to claim it, but just to be awakened by it, and then go into my Christian background and my Celtic Irish background and learn about how water was talked about back there. So that's how that book came about, and that particular journey, which has been a kind of model for other journeys.
Yes, what I'm hearing is that faced with this, very visceral water struggle in Detroit, that you began listening to and weaving in indigenous voices, even biblical voices. And so why are you finding it essential to weave these streams together, the ancient and the mythic, along with the political?
Yeah. I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Anymore, When I look around the world in crisis and I have access to so many different voices, Christian voices, Buddhist voices, Christianity itself, 45,000 denominations on the planet as we talk. What is Christianity? Oh, who are you talking? Christian voices, Buddhist voices, Hindu voices, indigenous voices from Bodun, from Santeria, Candomblé, the Aita in the Philippines, and 180 other indigenous communities there, et cetera, and secular folk and scientific folk and political folk and policymakers and Extinction Rebellion, et cetera. Who am I going to listen to and how am I going to decide? Anymore, for me, what I want to know is what has worked over time for a given community in a given place. Who has the track record of living in such a way that they did not need to go elsewhere for generations? Aboriginal folk in Australia, 60,000 years in some of the hardest terrain on the planet, never had to aggress and go anywhere. What did they know about how to live there? Pomo Indians in Northern California, 12,000 years, same neighborhood, same kind of thing. Never had to go aggress on anybody else. Lived sustainable in that place, generation after generation. Anymore, when I'm looking at the mess we're in, those are the voices I'm going to prioritize because they've got the track record behind them. So that's what I'm committed to listening to. Then going up inside something like the Bible, which I would understand as a state-produced text. Anytime you have writing, you have to ask the question, how does something get written? It takes time to learn how to manipulate the pen on the paper or the stylus on the clay tablet, depending on how far back you want to go. It takes a lot of time. If you're learning to write, what are you eating? Because you're not growing your own food. You're using your time to learn writing and then to do writing. If there is not surplus being produced and somebody feeding you while you do the writing, somebody who's growing the crop, not themselves consuming it, handing it off usually under force to somebody else who then hands it to you, if that is not going on, you're not going to write. Writing only came into being in a concerted way with city-state systems, with surplus product generation. So writing itself is indicative of being undergirded by an appropriative social, political, economic system called a city-state. And that's true for the Bible as for anything else. There's some instances of indigenous writing that was ritual, that wasn't answering to that, but they weren't writing books. They were doing small-scale kinds of things, serving their mystic and ritual lives. Writing came into being initially as accounting and then as the kind of legal order and narrative order that would rationalize plunder, put most simply. Surplus. Some people get to live well at the expense of other people. A bunch of people do the labor to grow the crops or herd the animals pastorally, and the elites sit back and live on the fat of that system by imposing taxation and claiming the surplus. Hebrew Bible came into being that way. It's a text to license monarchical land grants. The genius of it for me is that it also kept alive a minority report. You have the prophetic movement, all these prophetic voices that are critiquing that choice to be like the people around, to finally anoint a monarch and settle in a city. And under those prophetic voices, you have even older intimations of people who lived indigenously to scale in that part of the world, many of them Canaanite, a few of them Egyptian, a few Mesopotamian, and early Judaism. And in the earliest city-states, as they emerged, the first human resistance movement were the herders who were integrated into that oppressive economy, but who could take their herd animals out with them when they went to graze and not return, and be integrated into the grasslands around, away from the city center and the cultivated fields, just fine by their herd animals. You couldn't do that so easily if you're a peasant. You could take your seeds with you, but you got to plant them, and then you got to wait 4, 5, 6 months till it fruits. You're going to die. Peasants had trouble resisting city-state conscription because if they walked out, what are they going to eat? But herders could exit and did. And their herd animals would give them all they needed in the grasslands away from the city center. That's how the biblical tradition began. And the choice ultimately to go city-state with Saul and then David and then Solomon was utter betrayal in the understanding of the tradition. So you've got all this stuff down under the surface in the Bible. My commitment now is to pull that up. The agencies of water, of wind, of storm, of rock, of ravens, of doves, of fish, and so on. It's there, but it's a couple layers down under the state-controlled surface.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. And first of all, as someone who enjoys writing, it's such a damning indictment on the origins of my craft. So I get it.
I love it too. I'm a poet, a writer, and I'm never happy, but yeah.
Yeah, the surplus that was necessary to have the time dedicated for it. And it is interesting, right? With especially the Hebrew scriptures, because they are the written form of an oral culture. And so you have that sort of tension going on. I was an undergrad when I discovered the stark narrative difference between First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel on the one hand, which seemed to preserve this sort of anti-monarchical, consolidation lens. And then First and Second Chronicles, which totally praised it, celebrated it. That was obviously state propaganda. Even when I was a conservative evangelical, I was like, wow, what a contrast this is.
Yeah. And the Hebrew language is interesting in this regard. It probably was created, according to latest archaeological research, by oppressed miners in Egyptian mines in the Sinai who could see their overlords trading in hieroglyphics and knew they couldn't ever learn that. They didn't have the leisure. But they invented a kind of proto-Canaanite Hebrew sound system, written consonantal system, 22 consonants that ultimately became the Hebrew alphabet. But then as that was taken up by this pastoral nomad, renegade, escaped slave, amalgamated with rebellious Canaanite peasants that became Israel in the Canaanite interior, as that language was taken up, one of the things they did is they never wrote the vowels. That was added 1,000 to 1,500 years later. So the language had constant indirection in it and little gaps where your breath was necessary to supply the vowel sounds. So it's written, but it also is oral. It's an amalgamation of a kind of orality and honoring of air, even while you're pinning down certain kinds of sound. And then with, the primal revelation in that tradition, which is Moses, who grew up fat and sassy in Pharaoh's court, tried to interrupt a beating when his blood began to speak to him in midlife, and he wanted to know where he came from, and went out to his people who were enslaved and killed an Egyptian overseer, and then was OG, original gangster, with respect to Egypt, had to get out of the situation and fled to Sinai and didn't have the skills to live. How's he going to eat? He met at the well there, a well in the Sinai, a woman, and helped her get her water. And then she invited him to her clan, and he married into a pastoral nomad clan. And it took 40 years to finally get to the point where, as an old man of 80, he could hear a bush speak. And the primal revelation was a vegetable revelation. And the way that gets taken up in the subsequent tradition is the identification of that voice, the self-identification, as it interacts with Moses. And Moses says, I'm OG with respect to Egypt. I don't want to go back there. What am I going to say to people? Who sent me? And the voice says, I am sent you to run that. Which is probably a refusal to be captive to a word, because in Hebrew, there is no future tense. Present tense goes bail for the future tense. It handles both present and future happenings. You have to know which one it is by context. It's most likely in that interaction, the voice is saying to Moses, I will be who I will be for you. Do what's in you to do. Go do it. You will know me in hindsight. You will know me only on the way. I will be who I will be. I'm wild. I will not be domesticated to a name, to a ritual, to ways you want to control me and manipulate me and lock me down, incarcerate me in a word. And then Jewish tradition, ever after that, says whenever you run across those consonants, YHWH, or the first person version of that, you don't say it. You have to substitute another word. You have to do a mental stutter step. And that very practice of interrupting your speech, I think, is genius, because it reminds you, you don't have anything locked down. It's way bigger than your little mental impression.
Yeah.
Years.
Yeah. You substitute it with Adonai or even Hashem, more and more like kind of distance from that holy pulsating mystery of I will be what I will be. Yeah. How interesting that culture, that Hebrew culture that has informed Christianity and Islam subsequently does exist in that sort of fertile crescent, one of the first areas that begins developing complex agriculture and these various layers of stratification and really alienation from the more human world, from a sense of community, a sense of the sacred. And yet it preserves some of it. And I feel like in your work and in the books we're talking about, you vibrate with a clear sympathy for indigenous worldviews, seeing this other kind, the plants, the animals, the stones, the rivers, as kin. So how might an animist reenchantment of place be a form of social and political resistance, as well as a place for genuine renewal for our species?
Yeah. So I think it's hard at this time. And all I know to do is, as I have been saying, try to learn from those cultures. And I use the word indigenous in a very particular way. Maybe I shouldn't be using it. I understand that. Don't know a better word to use. Maybe land taught, maybe ancient, maybe tribal, maybe clan. There is no perfect word. But when I'm using the word indigenous, what I mean is not primarily a bloodline, but a lifestyle, a way of living in relationship to the more than human world, as I was talking about just a few minutes ago, that has a proven track record of being able to live sustainably in place over generations. And I could use the word animist for the practices in relationship to that lifestyle. Most of those lifestyles that I'm aware of indeed understand themselves as relatively younger compared to many of the other species they're in interaction with and utterly interdependent with, if not dependent on. And they have ways of honoring them ritually and in story, in the mythologies that tell, that keeps the community awake and alive to its limitation, which I think is the key question for us today. Again, going back to the scaling laws thing from the Paleontology Database Project. We're out of niche, we're out of scale, it would seem, according to that research. And I think the big question for us in all of our cleverness, all of our high-tech, innovative brilliance, are we able to limit ourselves? It doesn't look too good.
Restraint in our strong suit.
Yeah. So animism is a a way of relating to the more than human world as alive, as spiritual, as teacher, elder, kin, that I think in and of itself imposes some measure of limitation. It says you can't just take these things up. You have to interact. You have to ask permission. You have to listen for the communication back, what you might hear and know. Can you hear? And then learn how to take what you need in a way that doesn't take everything, that allows that species to continue to thrive, like Robin Kimmerl talking about the honorable harvest, all of her experiences and how you approach a plant that you want to eat. You don't just grab it and you actually interact with it.
Sure.
How do we do that as modern people or as urban people?
Yeah.
We just start. And I don't have a policy remedy for the mess we're in now. I don't have a high-tech remedy that would make it all better. The indigenous teacher that my wife and I spend time with, Martine Prechtel, for more than 12 years now, will constantly say to us, you have an indigenous soul in you. Everybody does. Somewhere in you and back in your line. But as modern people, you're not going to become indigenous. In fact, your modern self is terrified of your indigenous self. It's going to take serious work to allow that part of you to come back into consciousness and back up onto the surface. Don't run off and try to create a pure community separate from empire, separate from neoliberal globalization. You're just going to reproduce it.
Mm.
You need to do is metabolize it, eat it and compost it, and then recognize that it's not about you. You're not here to get what you want. That's not why human beings are here. Contrary to everything we're taught. It's not about you. It's not about us. We've been around 3 million years. The planet's been around 4.6 billion years. Life's been around 3.8 billion years. We're new, young, immensely clever, and immensely stupid, all at its own point. But what he will say is, be a seed. Do what you can to remember and recover and learn a few hands-on skills and a few indigenous ways of being, and understand that you will sow yourself in the soil, and hopefully something will pop up in the future that's not for you, it's down the road. But you will be somebody worth descending from. So that model of a seed, which is also a model that Jesus gives at one point in John 12. That's marching into Jerusalem. He's already cleared out the temple. He has a price on his head. It's dangerous. He knows what's going to go down. And some Greeks want to see him. And they approach Philip and Andrew, and Philip and Andrew run to him, say, these Greek folk want to see you. And Jesus halts and says, now my hour has come. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the soil and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, then it bears fruit. Well, that image is of wild wheat, just the way he says it. It's not wheat that is sown. Seed grain falls off the wreck of itself. It's wild. And he's lifting that up as the model for his movement. You want to know how to think about yourselves? Be a seed, be a wild seed. Let yourself be sown. And then immediately after that in the text, there's a voice from heaven that some people hear as a thunderclap and others hear as an angel speaking, which I would hear as an affirmation from the clouds that indeed being a seed is what it's all about, and we're going to respond with rain. Kind of a natural affirmation. Similar kind of thing happens in Mark's gospel in chapter 4 when Jesus opens his clinic by the Sea of Galilee and does his whole thing on sowing seed and runs through 3 different parables on sowing seed, a bit of interpretation of one of the parables, and then is met with a storm as they're crossing the Sea of Galilee. Once again, seed teaching draws a response from the sky with what it needs. It needs rain. If you want to read it that way, it's there. in the text.
Is that why you provocatively call the Bible a book of weather and you talk about Jesus as a water warrior?
Yes. The oldest image we have, I'm looking here, the red verse. I want to, yeah. So as I have said, Israel is a mixed amalgam. A mixed amalgam walks out of Egypt. Joshua and company crossed the Jordan from east to west. And some people they fight, some people they ally with, according to Joshua and Judges. Archaeologically, our best understanding is the Canaanite city-states on the Mediterranean seaboard were all in revolt. Iron technology had been introduced for the first time. It was possible to go up into the rocky interior and cultivate, never been possible before. And peasants were revolting. They were taking their herd animals, but also their seed, going up and then making raids back down to the city-state systems to get more recruits, more seed, more herd animals. And they were already in place. And then Joshua and company joined them, and the whole amalgam becomes a thing called Israel, worshiping YHWH. Well, Israel's the name that has a name of a god up inside of it, theomorphic name. What's the name of God up inside Israel? El, Canaanite God. Why is a Jewish group worshiping or naming itself after a Canaanite God? But it's not just Jewish. In fact, Jewishness as a bloodline doesn't exist at that point in time. Yeah, you have some people that were descended from Abram, but it's a mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. They amalgamate with Canaanite peasants, become this mixture of peoples worshiping a mixture of gods. And early Israel, it's pretty clear now, was polytheist. You had YHWH, you had El, you had Baal, you had his sister Anat, you had Asherah, you had Astarte, all up in there. And only slowly do the other names get kicked out while their functions are appropriated under YHWH as supposedly one deity, although you never entirely get rid of the El thing. Elohim appears more than 2,000 times in the Hebrew Bible, YHWH 6,000 times. Both of them, and particularly Baal alongside El, is a storm god. And YHWH sort of assumes that role. And there is no more common image in the Hebrew Bible, concrete image of what YHWH is than a storm. And that makes all kinds of sense in that part of the world, which is largely arid. That the closest thing you can get to touching divinity is the water you drink. The water that comes down out of the sky as rain is the body of deity. It's what you need. It's the primary blessing. And all of these things go in many directions to talk about. But
Yeah.
the escaped slaves have to go through what Moses went through, 40 years of having Egypt debrided out of them. And the very first question they encounter is, what are they going to eat? Like anybody who's going to walk out of empire. How are you going to keep your body alive? What are you going to eat? And what do they eat?
Manna.
Yeah. And what is manna? Yeah, some quail. Actually, there's something else going on. Identify that. The word in Hebrew is translated, what the F is it? Without the F in it. But what it probably is aphid defecation. Aphids are little scale insects that poop 130% their body weight every hour after eating tamarisk leaves. They're up on the branches of the tree. So this stuff is falling out of the sky. It puddles at the base of the tamarisk tree, and you can scoop it up and bake it into honey loaves, which is exactly what Arab Bedouin in the Sinai do today, and they call it man. And they are told with respect to that, scoop up enough for 1 day at a time. And every 6 days for 2 days, not an iota more, which is a primal lesson, even before the 10 Commandments, about how they are to eat, how they are to behave economically and ecologically. Not doing what they were doing in Egypt. In Egypt, they were enslaved to make bricks to build storage cities for grain, for Pharaoh's food as weapon policy. to store the surplus grain and divvy it out to those who were loyal and not divvy it out to those who weren't. They are told before anything else, don't do that. Learn the land. It will provide, but you have to learn it and you have to accept what it gives, even if it's insect shit. Because that's the way it's put together. I'm addicted to plant food. I take it up my nostrils every few seconds. Called oxygen. And I don't plan on stopping the addiction anytime soon if I can help it. That's the way ecology works. One species output is another species input.
Yeah.
So anyway, they go through 40 years of having to learn that before they can even then emerge into Canaan. And I forget now where I was going with this.
Well, we're talking about, the Bible as a book of weather, Jesus as a water warrior, and generally these different framings of what, for many of us in the West, we just take for granted. It's these sort of flannel graph Bible stories, but really recognizing how wild they are. And what I'm hearing and what you're sharing is just how much indigeneity there is to that coming out of Egypt back into more of a rhythm with the land.
That's right. That's what it was. And as they go through that 40 years, it only takes 11 days to go from the crossing of the Red Sea to the crossing of the Jordan River near Jericho. You can do that walk in apparently about 11 days. They took 40 years because it's not about getting where they're going. It's about learning the land. It's about getting Egypt out of them, empire out of them, and getting another way of living into them. So the other thing that happens as they leave Egypt, and if you read through the Exodus stories and pay attention, it's very interesting. They refuse to leave Egypt if they don't have their herd animals. It's just what we were talking about pastoral nomadism. Pharaoh tries to get them to leave their herd animals behind, because he knows if they just go out to worship for 3 days and don't have the goats and the sheep, cattle with them, they have to come back.
Yeah.
If they go with those things, then it's up for grabs. And they know that as well. So Moses refuses the bargain. Says he will not leave Egypt without the herd animal. That's how they survive. Yes, they have to learn the land, and it's the herd animals that primarily integrate them into the land. Just like the clan Moses married into, the Midianites and Kenites. Midianites were pastoral nomads, Kenites, Jethro's father-in-law, couples. But as they're getting done with that Egypt or that wilderness, so-called sojourn, wilderness not as something to get out of, wilderness is the primary place of meeting God, meeting yourself, and learning how to live. Moses concocts for them this Sabbath Jubilee tradition, the schoolhouse of the sevens, when they get back into an agricultural venue, so they don't forget what they learned about living on the land, being responsible to the land, being owned by the land, not getting confused that the land belongs to them. And the beginning of that is what we were just talking about, this aphid defecation moment, where they are told 6 days, once per day, you gather. This is returning to hunting and gathering, as well as being a pastoral nomad. You're gathering aphid defecate. And then the 7th day, you rewild. The 7th day, you let the aphids be themselves, you be yourself. You let the land be itself. You let the herd animals be themselves. You do that as a regular practice from now on. And then you also remember it in the 7 weeks between Passover and Pentecost. In the 7th month, you go out into the field for 7 days under a bushy ramada, even though you're growing crop. You live like you did in Sinai, your skin open to the sky, the rain, the sun, the winds. And then 7th year, the Sabbath year, you release all debts and you don't plant. How do you live? You have to hunt and gather. That's all you can do. You're not planting. And then every 7 times 7 years, you do the Sabbath year, and then you blow a ram's horn and you do another year where you don't plant. And then you do plan, and it's, 4, 5, 6 months. So that's 2.5 years where you're going to hunt together. That's the framework to keep them in tune with what they supposedly learned in the wilderness.
Living
And
in
it
Galatian
is,
land, yeah.
you can even make the case that they learned the number 7 in that ultimately from the rains. In that part of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, the seasons are such that the rains come in October and periodically happen during the winter. They cease in April, May, and then you get a very hot summer. And towards the end of the summer, you get the Sirocco winds blowing up from Saudi Arabia, from the southeast. They bring plague, desiccation, drought, everything dies. And Sukkot, the 7th month thing, was actually originally a rain ritual that you're doing in late September, early October, appealing for the storms to come in off the Mediterranean, going west to east. Sirocco is blowing east to west. And there's an interchange period in the fall where those winds are battling each other. Drought is battling with fertility. And that was codified in the Canaanite mythology. Baal faced off with Mut, wrestling. And apparently those storms coming in off the Mediterranean do so with fair regularity for about 6 to 7 years at a time. And then they typically go AWOL for a year. According to a scientific report of about 10 years ago. And some thinking then that maybe that's where Israel got the notion originally of this Sabbath rest thing. They were learning from the primary element they needed to survive, the behavior of the rains, teaching. We'll conform to your needs to do agriculture for 6 years, but then we're going to do our own thing for a year. You need to learn from that, learn to do that for yourselves and everything else around you that you're dependent on.
Wow. Well, given that as an inspiration and a template, and winding down for now, we should go on. I would love to have you back on and talk about more of these ideas. But as a kind of denouement for now, how might aspiring followers of the way, people who find some inspiration in the words and teachings and power and life of Jesus, regardless of their relationship with organized religion or not, some of these folks who are tuning in are, very dedicatedly in emotionally healthy progressive churches. Other people are in the throes of spiritual deconstruction and malaise. But regardless, how might we today reclaim a relationship to spirit that is as visceral, local, and weather-tuned as the Hebrew people, as Jesus?
Yeah.
Big question, I realize.
And I think there are multiple things I would say in response. One is, I don't think we'll get there. Number one, don't imagine you're going to be able to do it the way the Hebrews did or the way Jesus did.
And
Given there are 8 billion of us on the planet, when there's not enough land to do that kind of thing, we're going to have to slowly work our way back towards something like that. So here in Detroit, there are all kinds of folk who are involved in community urban gardening. They're using vacant land, abandoned land in the inner city to organize neighborhoods, to start to grow their own crops, to step out of the industrial food system. That's a beginning step. Learning plants, hand-on, learning how to grow your own food. In the process, learning to talk to the plants, to learn from the plants, not just using them as your food resource, but as an interdependence that you need to be trained by. That would be one step. I often talk about walking on 2 legs, which may be ableist. So I also try to talk about it as juggling 2 different basic concerns.
Right.
For me, I'm committed to responding to the emergency of the hour, whatever it is. So I was deeply involved in the water struggle, including getting arrested. blocking trucks. I will continue to do that. Now it's more Palestinian stuff going on in Detroit because we've got a very large Middle Eastern population in Dearborn. So they're leading that. I will continue to do that, be involved, pushing back on whatever the form of repression that is most immediate around me as best I can with other folk, looking to BIPOC folk to lead and collaborating with them. But also the other concern, the other leg, if you want, is to ask these deeper questions. What are we really aiming at? So when we were doing the water struggle, people had their water shut off. I was part of delivering water, not just trying to protest, but also delivering water every other week to people who had their water shut off. What do we deliver it in? It's not like we could bundle up a river and bring it to their blood. Plastic bottles. What the hell am I doing? Increasing the number of plastic bottles in the world, which plays right into the hands of Nestle, that's sitting, an hour north of Flint, pulling water out to the tune of 200 to 400 gallons per minute on a private piece of property, for whom the water shutoffs are an absolute windfall. They're selling bottled water to everybody that now needs it for the communities where it's been shut off. It's immediate. We need to get water to these people, even though we're increasing the amount of plastic in the world, and we've got a crisis of that. So I'm going to respond. I'm going to deliver the water, but I'm also going to ask this other question about, do I really want more plastic? What is plastic doing to the world? It's up in our brains. It's coming out of our taps, 94% of the taps in the US, et cetera. And I'm going to continue to ask all the kinds of things we've been talking about, this big indigenous, more than human world. How do we get back there? How do we actually live in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't need electricity, that doesn't need computers, given what they're doing to the world in terms of co-opting water and co-opting electricity, and therefore requiring mining, cobalt, lithium, coltan, et cetera, all over the globe. Is that really sustainable? I don't know. But I'm going to ask those questions. I'm going to do both of those. That's the second. Third thing I would say, and then we can end it or whatever. I mentioned the redbirds. So I'm here in inner city Detroit, and there's not a lot of wild nature around me, although there's spiders in my room that I have learned to appreciate and talk to, and actually look to as omens once in a while. But also about 5 years ago, a redbird one night started chirping at me in the early evening outside my second floor study window. And I got up and stood up at the window and mimicked him, chirped back. I have no idea what I was saying, but we went back and forth for about 5 minutes. Since then, he summons me to feed him sunflower seeds and his mate. And I've become a kind of slot machine for seeds for them. 5 years now, probably averaging about 4 to 5 times per week, sometimes 4 times per day, depending on the season. And they will summon my attention on the tree branches just outside my window. I'll let you look at that, see what that looks like, just right there, like that. And they'll crash dive my window if I'm not paying attention and just pull up like a couple inches short. And then they'll be in the bush when I go down to sprinkle the seed outside the front door, and they'll feed and then go their way. And I've had a number of instances of significant interaction time-wise with them on that. I could go into that, but I don't want this to get too long. Point being, that's become personal for me. They know me. They know how to get my attention when they want it. Sometimes I'll be walking out the sidewalk and they'll zoom at me from way down the sidewalk and drive me back in the house to get seed for them. Say, please give us some seed before you go drive away and pollute the world more, would you please? And I do. But I take that seriously. I've got a relationship that's somewhat personal, which is why I interrupted us earlier. Because if they were at the window, I'm going to respond. And that's important to me, important enough to interrupt even.
Yeah, because you've been talking.
And that's all I know to do. Pay attention to whatever of wild nature is around you. And if something starts to respond to you, honor that. And then for me, it's a methodology of once something in the wild catches my eye, I'll go to the science on it and learn what I can scientifically about it. Then I go to the mythology, native mythology, Celtic mythology. What's in the Bible about that creature if that creature's in the Bible? And try to increase and expand the scientific knowledge. And that's a discipline for me. And I value that. I just little relationships here and there. It's not going to translate into an indigenous lifestyle. It's a seed.
Yeah. I love that, Jim. What I'm hearing you saying is that you are opening your life and your heart and your actions and your being into relationship, into multivalent relationship, certainly with the, BIPOC folks who are your neighbors and friends and co-strugglers, and also with the more than human world, and undoubtedly informing your perceptions of the divine as well. And that you're taking this multivalent approach. You're not jettisoning the scientific worldview. It's a part of what's informing you, but also listening to the myth of people who, as you've said, have done maybe a better job living longer than we have, more sustainably than we have. And so what are the knowledge ways and the insights that they have? And can you bring all these into your life? And can you exist in integritous relationship with all your relations?
One last little thing occurs to me to squeeze in: water in the Bible. Jesus in John 7 goes up to the Feast of Sukkot incognito because he's got a price on his head, and stands up on the last day next to the altar after they poured water on it from the Shiloh springs to clear the blood of the animal sacrifices. He pops up, ventriloquizes Isaiah 55, says, "Whoever's thirsty, let them come and drink. For out of his belly," is what it says in English, "shall flow rivers of living water." Except the word in Greek for belly is actually the word womb. It's a transgender, they're bending verse. And the image really is of water breaking in the birth process. Right. That is informing that. But it's ventriloquizing Isaiah 55, as I said. And you go back and read that, and verses 1 and 2, we'll talk about, come, eat, drink, no price. But where it goes in Isaiah by verses 10 and 11 and 12 is talking about the rain that falls on the mountain as the prime reference for the word of God. That is to say, the word of God is like rain, not the other way around. The primal thing is rain. Mm-hmm. The word of God is like rain, not the other way around. And it's saying the primal water breaking, flushing downstream, giving life, nutrient, biodiversity to every creature downstream, enabling them to live, to come to life, plants to poke up through the soil, is rain. So yes, John 7 is water breaking in a womb of a human mother. But really what's behind that is water breaking on a mountain that is giving life to everything downstream. And so it's curious that the pronoun his is male and the noun womb is female. But then you go back to John 1, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, blah, blah, blah. John is writing as a Jew, but thinking about Greeks because he knows he has to communicate to a Greek culture. So he's rummaging around in Greek culture and getting a word that will translate the word he is Jew is actually thinking. Because Jew is not thinking logos. He's thinking hokmah. He's thinking native wisdom from Proverbs 8. Who's there in the beginning, that's through whom everything happens and comes, setting limits on the sea, limits on Pleiades and Orion, limits on this, that, and the other thing. She is the divine, quasi-divine artificer, and she is doing drag as Jesus.
Well, that is as beautiful a benediction and a closing blessing as we're going to receive. Thank you, Jim, for that. And folks, if you're intrigued, if you're inspired, if you want to find more of Jim's work, I recommend that you check out jameswperkinson.com, which will be in the show notes. And Jim, do you have any gatherings or anything coming up that you're excited about, you'd like people to know about?
I'm going to a festival of radical discipleship celebrating Ched Meyer's Elaine Enns, handing off to Kirkridge folk, Eastern Pennsylvania Retreat Center that's been around for a long time. That's the end of next week. Other than that, I'm just hunkered down in Detroit, teaching at the seminary and writing stuff and trying to obey my boss, my wife.
Understood. Thank you then. Yeah. And folks, if today's conversation stirred something deep in you, maybe a grief or a yearning or a call to a wider fidelity, you're not alone. Jim is reminding us that the waters are still speaking and the land remembers. Spirit is not done weaving new possibilities through our willing hearts and hands. Please do check out jameswperkinson.com. Check out Political Spirituality, in Century of Water Wars, and Jim's other books. They'll unsettle you. They unsettle me, but just maybe they will rewild your soul. Until next time, friends.
That can be reached on this website for Ecumenical Theological Seminary. You can find me under faculty there. Get to me.
Okay, beautiful. Ecumenical Theological Seminary. Awesome. All right, everyone. Until next time, stay strange, stay rooted, and keep on listening.
Thank you.